Hello. Thanks everybody for coming out. I'm Alex, and it's great to see you here. Your attendance and book purchases allow us to continue to host events like this one, so we appreciate it. This evening we have the pleasure of hearing from William Sturkey as he presents The Ballad of Roy Benavidez with Daniel Wallace. William Sturkey is an associate professor of history at the University of Pennsylvania. He is the author of Hattiesburg, a finalist for the Benjamin L. Hooks National Book Award and winner of the 2020 Zocalo Book Prize, and the co-editor of To Write in the Light of Freedom. He lives in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Daniel Wallace is the author of 6 novels, including Big Fish, which was adapted and released as a movie and a Broadway musical. His novels have been translated into over 3 dozen languages. We hope you enjoy the event. Thank you again. And remember to grab a copy of The Ballad of Roy Benavidez up front after the reading, if you have not already. And now I will turn it over to these two. Thank you.
Historians bring out a classy crowd. Much classier than fiction writers. Because just anybody can come here a fiction writer, but you have to have a PhD, I think, to be here. Is that not true?
No. Not true.
Not true?
Not true.
Well, thank you all for coming and to celebrate this incredible book by this incredible guy, William Sturkey, who I'm not a historian at all, but so you may wonder why I'm here to talk to William, and I'll fill you in 2018 we were at the Institute for Arts and Humanities and at UNC, and is what, no, that's 5 and a half years ago. And this gives you an opportunity to work on your book, your project, whatever it is, for the whole semester. No teaching duties, you just get to focus on that. And we both introduced our books at very early stages of the composition. And William, of course, was working on this one, and I was working on mine. Mine came out a little while ago, and his, really the pub date was 2 days ago, and so that's why you have this balloon with the sprinkles on top. You know? Not just a happy birthday balloon, but also the sprinkles on top, which I thought really took it over the top. Anyway, so I loved his project. He loved mine, and also they do this wonderful thing at the IAH. And you probably remember that you get a coffee mug or tea mug, and your name is on it. They put your name on inscribed in the mug, and I didn't realize that the name was on it, and I started using his mug. And I think that might be the first time we actually spoke, is when you said, "You have my mug."
I'd applied to the IH and got turned down before. I wanted one of these mugs, so when I finally got a hold of it, and he took it, I was very upset.
Well, my mug has met a sad end. What about yours?
I use it all the time.
That was the problem. I used it too much. I overused it. But all mugs have their day. So that's how we met. That's the reason that I'm here, and I want to talk about this, the remarkable book that came from that. And it's just to have been in that room, and I was going through old emails today, and we would send each other, or the entire everybody who's part of the program, excerpts from our work, saying, well, how do you think it's going? What do you think I should do here? What do you think should be there? And I was looking back at some emails that you would send, and that it went from that books began. That's what's hard to believe sometimes. They begin just with that first word, that first sentence, that first idea, and then they become this incredible work of art. But before we get to the book, I want you to just tell me actually, because maybe you know, why are you a historian? Why did you become a historian?
I didn't expect that question at all. I thought it would be a little bit more targeted. But it always made sense to me. And it always, and I'm going to talk about being an artist today. And I think that, if you look at the footnotes of my book, you're gonna disagree with that. I'm not an artist, I'm a scholar, I'm an academic. That's all very much true. But it always offered me a great creative impulse. And I was always connected to this historical instinct, to see something for the way that it really was, to understand why things got to be a certain way. It was always very empowering for me to learn the backstory of things. And I think that's what really drove me to that. But then when I began doing my own research and writing creatively and thinking about how you can tell stories and where I want to tell stories and whose story I get to tell, those were all very attractive to me. And I couldn't imagine doing anything else except for maybe being a novelist. And to me, those things were always very close. This one's, nonfiction. But yeah, I think it was pretty much built into me, and then through the circumstances of my life, I've pursued the projects that I have.
Right. Well, it's interesting that you make that comparison, because another example of what you do, what I do, is that the inherent and well-known subjectivity of a novel. A poem is always very much associated with the author, and a historian. That subjectivity is sometimes sort of swept under the rug. And is there a responsibility that you feel to being who you are, and also trying to create work that becomes part of the canon in its own way, that it becomes the accepted story of this man, for instance?
Yeah, I think I want to tell stories about people that have been historically marginalized, non-white working class people. That's just who I am. And so to center their stories, center their experiences is something that I'm always going to do as a historian. And I think that, so like my publisher, for example, has never published a single history of Hispanic American in the whole history. They've been around since 1952. And that group of people is dramatically underrepresented. So it was really special to me. I was really attracted to the opportunity to take a working class Hispanic man who wasn't a singer or an immigrant, and to really tell his story, to really center the experiences of those people, because they are severely underrepresented. And somebody went through the process of trying to sell the book, publishers just don't want these stories right now. And it's just wild that 20% of the population is Hispanic, and there's just not that much out there. So I hope that it's at the beginning of a wave. And I think that's what it's hopefully going to do. But something that takes us just beyond sort of the border and the immigration story. Obviously, that's a huge part of the Hispanic American experience. But like my subject, he was not an immigrant. He's fifth generation Texan. So there's a lot more stories to be told, I think, about Hispanic American history.
Well, take us from there, because he's not an immigrant. He was 5 generations. Tell us a little bit about Roy and why Roy, why this story? As you said, there's so many that could be told. Why this one?
Yeah, so I might forget to get into some of the details of that, but I first met Roy. I was sitting almost certainly alone in my apartment. I had just started graduate school, University of Wisconsin, and YouTube. I was just discovering YouTube. This is like 2005, 2006, and of course, America was at war. And that's when I first saw a speech of Roy Benavidez on YouTube. I was about a year out from the 2004 election, and I fought harder in that election than I ever have before, because I come from a place where young people go to the military to go to college. And I graduated high school in 2000. One of my friends was killed in 2003 in Kuwait. Another friend of mine came back and died of a heart attack at the age of 32. And we're at this moment where the country had said, I thought very much in 2004, the best way to support the troops is to bring them home. And America rejected that vision. America said, no, we're going to keep sending kids like the ones you went to high school with off to war. And at the same time, there was this like subculture of the way that we treat the military and appreciate them. And you all know what I mean. It's flyovers, and it's parachutes, and it's like videos of soldiers and their families being reunited. And at the same time, we're sending them off to this war that I didn't think needed to be fought. And, it was really disturbing to me what we said about how we value and treat veterans, but then what the policies actually look like. And so right around that time, I found Roy's story, and I saw him speak. And I was becoming a little junior historian, and I could use newspapers, and I could pull up a newspaper article from 1981 and see what people said about Roy then. And so I heard the speech, and I know that he was honored by Ronald Reagan, and there's this whole thing about the right wing and the military that starts quite literally with Roy Benavides. That's the beginning of our sort of politics of memory with veterans right now. But then I read in the newspaper that Roy lost his disability benefits. So famous Medal of Honor recipient who in the New York Times front page kicked off the disability rolls as the Reagan administration was purging people from the rolls, getting rid of the social welfare state. And so that really hit with me. That really resembled something with me because I was, thinking about, well, why are 22 veterans every single day in America killing themselves? Why are we going through these wars? Why have more veterans died in Iraq than Americans killed at 9/11? So these sorts of things didn't quite add up. So when I heard Roy's story, that just really clicked. Because I said, this is what I see today. That on one hand, we have the big pomp and circumstance, and we celebrate veterans in one particular way, and then, kick them off the Social Security disability rolls. And that's what really provided me with the energy, I think, to really pursue the story. Also, so Roy's a Vietnam veteran. His action that he's famous for did not occur in Vietnam. It occurred in Cambodia. And of course, a lot of people are familiar with the 1970 invasion of Cambodia and Kent State. The United States had boots on the ground in Cambodia from 1966 on every single month of every single year. And nobody knows that story. So when I got to all the different elements of who Roy was, and I thought he was so captivating as a speaker, but then the theme of, how do we celebrate veterans versus how we actually treat them, all of that sort of became this really combustible story that I was really interested in pursuing. I thought I couldn't for a long time. And in 2015, I came back to it and decided to ultimately pursue the book.
And you thought you couldn't because why?
Because I didn't speak Spanish, which I thought would be a great impediment. And of course, years later, when I met Roy's children and they told me that none of the three of them speak Spanish, I was like, damn, I should really... And growing up Hispanic in Texas in the 70s and 80s, they were telling kids, the parents, don't teach your kids Spanish so they can assimilate, which is crazy. And now it seems to me, but yeah, they don't even know Spanish themselves. And then I'm not a Vietnam War specialist. I just didn't have the background. So, but I now do. I taught myself that in Hispanic American history and tried to figure it out.
There is so much sort of sidebar history in this. I don't mean that in that it's brief or slight, but with Roy's story, you get the history of America in many ways. You get the history of the Vietnam War, post-Vietnam War politics, and how heroes are used for the selfish aims of politicians. It was all wrapped up in this really, if you read it quickly, superficially in a way, it would almost, you could almost see the American flag flying behind you as you read it, because you are actually celebrating a person who's willing to give his life for America. And in a way, he actually tries to. That is, he puts himself in a situation where almost everybody else has died. And not everybody is necessarily familiar with the day, which is almost, May 2nd, 1968, almost exactly 56 years ago, when Roy went back into a war zone in Cambodia to save some friends. I think you need to tell us, about that day, and because that is the heart of everything that goes happening here.
Sure, yeah. Just very briefly, so what the United States military was doing was looking for preemptive justification to invade Cambodia. That invasion came later, but the United States was dropping very small groups of people. They were designed to be undetected near the Ho Chi Minh Trail so they could document the usage of the Ho Chi Minh Trail by the North Vietnamese and by the Viet Cong, so that the United States could say, see, Cambodia is part of the war. We can go in and invade Cambodia. And they wanted international cover to do so, then also domestic cover. Because when the United States did invade Cambodia, of course, all hell broke loose domestically. So they were dropping teams of people. These are not draftees. These are professional soldiers, Green Berets. Green Berets were the most famous soldiers of the Vietnam War, probably in the world. And they're dropping these teams of 12 people. They're also working with indigenous mercenaries from the Laotian highlands and Vietnamese highlands. And they're dropping these 12-man teams near the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And they're looking for the enemy. And because they're looking for the enemy, they find the enemy all the time. And they're always outnumbered almost every single time. And they get dropped in with these helicopters to study and observe the enemy. It's called MACV-SOG, Study and Observations Group. And they bring that information back to the Pentagon and say, okay, you know, can we bomb Cambodia? Can we invade Cambodia? How can we stop this? And so Roy is part of a unit where he's getting dropped off near the trail. And he's not out on this day, May 2nd, but his friends go out one day and they almost instantly run into a couple hundred regular North Vietnamese. And it's just all hell breaks loose. And there's all this there's tons of shooting, helicopters go in, 3 of the 4 helicopters that go in on the first try get turned back because of all the shooting. Another helicopter goes in, Roy jumps on board because he can hear the men screaming in the field from the radio station back at the base. And those are his friends. One of the people had saved Roy's life just a couple weeks before, and so he gets on and goes in. And over roughly the next 6 hours, Roy saves the lives of at least 8 Americans and their allies, single-handedly holds off a couple hundred people along with the Air Force, which he's calling in airstrikes and helicopter and the jets. I've never written anything like that. That was crazy to write. But so he saves about 8 men, very nearly dies himself. He gets shot 7 times. And you know, and then the final scene of the battle, he's quite, I've never written anything like this. He's holding his intestines in one arm and he's got an AK-47 in the other, and he's like spraying the field, and like people grab him by under the shoulders and pull him back into the helicopter, and they take off. They fly the wrong way. They realize they're going further into enemy territory, then they come back the other way. But Roy doesn't get the Medal of Honor right after that. It takes 13 years because the United States was not in Cambodia in 1968, technically. And so it's this whole thing about him trying to fight for the recognition to be famous, and then this negotiation about how he's able to use that, how he's used by politicians, namely Ronald Reagan, and that whole thing. But there's a lot more to it in the middle of the book, but that's generally what happened.
There's a lot more to it, and it's an incredibly written scene. It's like out of it is, I say like out of a movie, because there's the only way that I would ever have any kind of relevant experience to something as intense and incredibly violent and heroic as this is in a movie, obviously. But he really did it. It's
the craziest thing I've ever written, but it's also the best documented thing I ever have, because they went and in trying to get the Medal of Honor, he went and got all these eyewitnesses, and that's part of the narrative. So it's like 14 eyewitness statements, including people that were on the ground, in the air, so on and so forth.
Yeah, it's just remarkable. The question I had for you is the title itself. Why did you decide to call it a ballad? In your emails, I saw your original title was To Be an American.
Yeah.
Yeah.
To be an American. So when Roy grows up in Jim Crow era Texas, he experienced exclusion from the moment he's born almost. And when he gets famous, he uses this phrase "to be an American" all the time. And he's not only saying like, I'm so proud to be an American, I really feel like he's reminding people that he is one. Because he didn't really get to be an American until he got to be a war hero. Right. And there's a whole complicated history about that and his family and everything else. But so the Ballad of Roy Benavidez it's a, you know, as authors, we have all sorts of little games built within the book, but it's a triple entendre, which is actually a word I've never said.
It's against the law here.
So there is an actual Ballad of Roy Benavidez. When he becomes very famous, one of the things that's really compelling about him is he's a hero to such a wide swath of people. John McCain, his 2004 book, When Courage Matters, or something like that it's called, opens up with Roy Benavidez. And George Bush and Perry from Texas, like all of these people, like a who's who. Ross Perot wrote the foreword to Roy's 1995 memoir. So that's the right wing. But then there's a guy that wrote an actual Ballad of Roy Benavidez. He was an ethnic studies professor at UTEP, and that was the left wing. He was a huge hero also to left-wing Latinos living in the United States. So there's an actual Ballad of Roy Benavidez, so that's one arm. The second is the Ballad of the Green Berets. So when Roy becomes a Green Beret in 1965, the United States, the war in Vietnam, it wasn't like World War II where you could say, okay, today we took Guadalcanal. Here it is on the map. We have that now. Vietnam wasn't about territory. It was about killing people. And so, like, without that sort of, advancement across the continent of Europe and Asia, like, what do you even hold on to as you're trying to grasp what's going on with the war? And the Green Berets in Vietnam were a stand-in for that. The song, like, people think of Vietnam War era music and the protest songs. The most commercially successful song of the Vietnam War era, by far, is the Ballad of the Green Berets. And of course, the book was put out. It sold 5 million copies. It later became a movie with John Wayne. Well, Roy's a real Green Beret, so it's kind of the Ballad of the Green Berets, nodding to that as well. And then also, Roy's father grew up in the tradition of corridos in Texas, Mexican ballads about lost loves, life on the old ranches, and he grew up singing these ballads. So the Ballad of Roy Benavidez also nods to his heritage of his father and what he grew up singing.
That's great. He actually was, he lied to get to become a soldier from the very beginning. I mean, he lied about his age. He lied about his, to become a paratrooper. He did this really, I mean, there's so many things that happened to him that really do feel like they're almost too good to be true, right? When he's in line to try to learn how to become a paratrooper, and he falsifies, what does he do? He falsifies his records right there? Yeah. So he's pretty severely injured. He never could have qualified for special forces, Green Beret Special Forces, I'm using the same thing. He never could have qualified normally. It only had to be during the war when the United States was absolutely desperate to get as many Green Berets as they could. But yeah, he's very banged up. He's not in great shape, and he backdates some paperwork and lies, as you say, to get into the program. But he's worried about getting kicked out of the Army. He joined the National Guard when he was the age of 16. He's an 8th grade dropout. Like, he had no other option in life, he thought. And he joined the National Guard, and he was in the Army, and he was terrified of the Army telling him he couldn't be in there anymore because he would basically have to go back to picking cotton or some sort of manual labor. And so he was always willing to, downplay his own injuries and sort of forge documents if need be in order to stay in the Army, because that was his livelihood. Yeah, and he continued that for the rest of his life because he lived barely after that firefight, but he was in terrible pain the rest of his life.
Yeah.
And yet he continued, he made as if he weren't.
Yeah, so that was what was so interesting when I first saw him and all that other stuff. I saw a guy who he's very self-deprecating. He calls himself stupid and a fool and stuff like that because he dropped out of school. But he dropped out of school when he was 14. It's not a 14-year-old's fault that they drop out of school. But the way that he was manipulating audiences very intentionally, the way that he talked about his own citizenship, the way that he talked about race, and in a way that just really allowed them to fall in love with him. Like, he was so good at running an audience and about, just giving people exactly what they wanted. And his whole life was like that. He was really a salesman. But you really understood it because it was his way of life. It became his personality. It became everything to him to be this great hero that could give up and give these speeches. And that's a huge part of the book is he gets really, really famous. So when he receives the medal, there's a few hundred Medal of Honor recipients from the Vietnam War, but most of them got it during the war or very shortly after. And then America was like, well, we don't want to talk about Vietnam anymore. So Roy got the medal in 1981 on the other side of that, in the long memory of the war. And this is when the Cold War begins to change in America. Platoon, Full Metal Jacket, all that stuff gets replaced by Rambo and Top Gun and all that sort of thing. People start calling Roy the Mexican Rambo, and they have a lot of similarities, actually. But so for Roy, for his final 17 years, he's the most recent living recipient of the Medal of Honor. So he gets brought out to everything. Reagan talks, every single time Ronald Reagan is in front of a Hispanic group, he talks about Roy Benavidez. The Reagan Library has this great index where you can look up subjects of speeches from Reagan's presidency. And that's what he does. The President of Mexico comes up, Camp David, Roy Benavidez. I did this for Roy Benavidez. We honored Roy Benavidez. It's all this and that all the time. But there's a give and take because Reagan's using him, but Roy's also using the fame himself. But he's also very, very careful. He can't say, America didn't really provide a great opportunity for me and my family early on. All he says is, I'm so grateful for America for giving me the opportunity to rise up from my poverty. one of the things in the book, so Roy's story gets told all the time. And it's almost always told by right-wing figures, pro-military politicians. So one of the things also with the book is like, I will not say this when I'm in Texas next month, but part of what I was saying was liberals don't get to be the ones that tell war stories in this country, and I wanted to do that. And so people talk all the time about, Roy joined the military is so wonderful, it lifted him up from his poverty. And Ross Perot, in the foreword to the 1995 book, says Roy's a classic American story about how a poor kid can join the military and become become middle class and all this is that. Look at what America can do. But I did something different. I talked about Roy's poverty, but I asked the question, why is Roy poor in the first place? And the whole first chapter is explaining why Roy is poor. Roy is not an immigrant. He's fifth generation Texan. His family used to own over 4,000 acres of farmland in Texas. And I detail the ways that those people lost their land after the revolution, when the white people came in, and ultimately when the United States, or when Texas joined the United States. The reason that Roy's family lost their land in Texas is because Texas joined the United States. So living in the United States is the reason why he's poor. So it becomes a lot more difficult, it gets trickier when you bring that part in. And Roy always said, I'm so grateful for America for lifting me up, but I think very clearly in the first chapter, I show how America basically robbed his family of their rightful titles.
And I think showing is accurate description of what you do, because there's not this, the voice that you use is not one of a lefty trying to undermine somebody's idea of what it means to be an American or in the military. You present the facts. You just you just write it down. Did you work on the tone of the book, how you were going to tell it, the voice you were going to use for it?
I mean, yes. I don't know how conscious I always was of that. But like the one thing that I wanted to do was educate people about what happened with that particular history, with the Hispanic Americans that lived in Texas before it became part of the United States. And that's a history that I think a lot of people can read. You can read a lot of history and never come across that story. But here, if you want to read about this war hero, you've got to know that story from now on. And I think that just speaks volumes about the way we talk about Hispanic Americans in this country, and also who's entitled to be a full citizen, in this country.
I took some notes, of course, as I was reading the book, but they weren't all great notes. I don't know what some of them mean, and I wrote down bull's testicles. Something Roy did with bull's testicles. What was that? Oh, okay. I think I remember now. It was big. It was a big event in his life.
So Roy was an orphan, and he constructed this story of where he came from. Like any good public speaker, could explain this is why I got here. And one of the stories that he tells explains how he became so tough. He had lost his father when he was 3 years old, and so he grows up. His mother gets remarried and starts to kind of ignore him, and ultimately he's sent away. And he doesn't have parents except for his aunt and his uncle, and so he's learning how to be a man, how to be a young man from other men that aren't his father. And when you don't have a father and you're growing up and you're looking at other men in society, you start to pick up lessons, whether they want you to or not. You see how men behave, you see how men interact with each other, how they interact with women, because you don't have that at home. And so you're hungry for how do I learn, how to operate in this society? And he really looked up to these cowboys, and he would run little errands for them. He's 7, 8 years old. And, they'd throw him a nickel for doing something. They would have him muck out the cow pens and stuff like that. One of the cowboys, is hanging out, and in front of his friends dares little Roy to run in and yank a bull by the balls. And so, Roy's very fond of telling this story that he does it. And, the bull obviously could have killed him or severely injured him, and he ran out. And the moral of the story, it's not about the actual balls, but the moral of the story is how this little boy without a dad learns to impress young men, and what men value, and what courage looks like. And sometimes, those unwitting actors, they have no idea that they're influencing a boy in that way, but the boy is watching them because he doesn't have anyone else to watch.
Right.
So that's where and there's a few different examples of that.
I'm going to open up the floor for questions in a second. Just one last thing I wanted to ask you was that you've spent the last 5.5 years with Roy. And probably, obviously, much longer than that because he's been on your mind for quite some time. What is it like to live with somebody that long in your mind and your heart? And how does it feel now to have this book, a testament to all that out in the world?
Yeah, I mean, it feels like the rest of the country is I'm still worried about the war on terror generation and nobody else is at this moment. But I think that, my whole life, certainly, we will be here. And I think that will come back. Obviously, we have a person now that sucks up all the media. So it's a little bit frustrating that so much of our attention is drawn to things like that and not to bigger, broader issues that I think could actually help improve the country. I think we should care a lot about how we treat veterans. And it's not just the Vietnam War veteran or the war on terror generation. We still have the World War II generation, the Korean War generation. So it's a big group of people. And that's not really in the news. So there is this moment where it does seem like a lot of people like me, Black historians of roughly my age, are writing books about George Floyd in that moment. And I'm writing about something that was 20 years ago, but I think that hopefully it's a timeless issue that will stick around. But it also, there's something exciting about creating and about the chase. And I don't know exactly what the terminology is. I think my partner and I use the term manic sometimes. But when you're writing and you think it's going well and you're up at 4 a.m. because you don't want to sleep anymore. You want to get out of bed before the kid gets up and get 1,000 words in, just like a machine, at the end there. And that's a great place to live in your head, and you're occupying that world when the world is burning outside of you, and you're like, man, I had a great day of writing today. I was in I was in the 1980s. Roy got to go speak at the American Legion, and all these kids, and in some ways it's a good distraction, I think, than actually dealing with the world. But I think if you're the people that lived with me at the time probably don't think that. But so yeah, honestly, it feels quite weird. Plus I gave this job talk at Penn that had nothing to do with this. They all think I'm writing about the National Negro Business League. So this thing came out now. Whatever. I mean, obviously they know, they had the book and everything, but yeah, so that feels kind of weird. I thought we hired a historian of African America. Why are you writing about this Hispanic Vietnam vet? But yeah, I don't know. It feels good, and I'm going to Texas to do a big event with Roy's family, and his daughter. So Roy's talked about all the time. I got the Google alert, but Veterans Day, Memorial Day, all that sort of stuff, constantly, graduation speeches. They still rename highways for him, and there's still sorts of clubs and parks all over the place. But his family's dealt with a lot of disappointment, people that come looking or promising something. The movie rights have been sold 4 times, and they're about to expire again. So they've been and Roy trying to make a movie himself, he really thought Reagan was going to help him with that, and he tried to lean on Reagan for that. But it was one of the great disappointments of his life that he was never able to get a film made. So they've had mixed interactions, but I really can't wait to go be with them. And this is very different than anything else anybody's ever said about Roy. They don't know the backstory of their family and the genealogy and all of that. So it's going to be really interesting, I think. So looking forward to that. But yeah, it feels quite odd, to have it finally out after all these years.
There's so many more questions that I would want to ask you, but I want to hear what questions are out there in the audience. So really, what would you like to ask William Sturkey? Yeah.
First of all, this is so well written and so well done. Congratulations.
Thank you.
I am particularly interested in the section in which you talk about how Roy decides to stand up for himself when he gets the letter that he's been denied his disability because they think now he should be able to lift 50 pounds even though his body was riddled, with bullets, etc. And I'd like to know if in the course of your research, you quote a lot of letters where people, once they hear about him and the news picks this up, there are other people who have been denied. And they begin to have hope because they think that if he can raise attention to this nationally, then something can be done, and ultimately something is. I'm wondering if among those persons for whom he stands, he has any relationship with Tejanos, and I'm not sure if that Tejano, is that how you pronounce it? Is that correct? Yeah, Tejanos in particular, and if in connection with making that stand and his persistence for that, he begins to have a different view of himself as an American.
So Roy gets a letter about 2 years after the big Medal of Honor ceremony, and it's a very cold Social Security letter, and it says things like, "We've determined without any sort of examination, we've determined that you can lift 25 pounds. Therefore, you can work so many hours a week. Therefore, your Social Security disability benefits that he has for the battle. He had 37 puncture wounds. That's why he gets disability. So then they say, no, you're done. We're kicking you off of this. And there were a lot of Americans who received letters like that. Not all of them were war heroes. And so Roy, he has to go through these terrible experiences. He had to go to a judge, and the judge makes him take his shirt off and stuff. And he's, it's just awful. He goes to a psychologist, and it's this whole runaround. And then he gets really mad one day, and he tells a reporter, and then it becomes a huge national story. Tom Brokaw, NBC Nightly News, Roy Benavidez is kicked off because he was really famous at that point in the early 1980s, and he starts to get all these letters from other veterans and their family members who are going through the same thing. And there wasn't necessarily a connection with Hispanic or Tejano or any sort of ethnic group or race, but it was a lot of people from the World War II generation saying that they were getting the very same type of treatment. And so that really put some wind in his sails to go and, and he always says, this isn't just about me, it's about all the other working class veterans that need this sort of support. And he's asked to testify in front of Congress, and there's this huge thing, and there's this funny moment in the book because the person that tests, so it's like this House Committee on Aging, and they bring up Roy, and he sits there in his uniform, and it's this big thing, it's on the national news. And the next person to testify is the 36-year-old governor of Arkansas, Bill Clinton. They just pass each other, like kind of in the hallway. And Roy did a favor for Clinton later, and they've met and everything. But yeah, so there wasn't like a specific ethnic group. But what I thought, like in thinking about how veterans of my generation were treated, I sort of suspected that the policies weren't matching up with the public ceremonies. And in doing the research about the Reagan era VA, Reagan's in office for 1 month before he gives Roy the Medal of Honor. And so it's this huge thing. Colin Powell is there and wrote about it. John McCain was there. Steve Bannon was there, of all people. Yeah, there's a whole Fox News. When Steve Bannon got in the White House, there was a Fox News story about how Steve Bannon became conservative. And they show a clip from this Medal of Honor ceremony from 1981. It's Roy's ceremony. And Fox News misreports what the ceremony actually was, but he's like, that's when I knew the Republicans were the one to support the military. And that's a huge theme in the book. But then when you look at what actually happens with the VA, a couple weeks after the ceremony, the Reagan administration proposes sweeping cuts to the VA. There were sit-ins. Vietnam veterans were having sit-ins at the Vets Hospital in Los Angeles to protest the Reagan administration in 1981. I never heard of anything like that. So it was just, it was just really quite looking at those policies and how it actually unfolded. And Reagan's first head of the VA, it's just amazing the scandals that he's involved in. So all the veterans groups are really upset, and they get behind Roy because it's this huge national story. There's an outcome that Roy really shapes. I'm going into a really long-winded professorial answer here, but hopefully that got your question.
Thank you.
Thank you. This is really fascinating, and it's great to see you back in Chapel Hill. I hope you come here more often. I was struck by the story you told about Roy's family being displaced, in effect, by what we might now call American imperialism, right? Like displacing these people. And some of the best known people of color of the Vietnam era, Muhammad Ali or Martin Luther King, they became vehement critics of the Vietnam War as an example of what was wrong about American history. Did Roy ever have any political ambivalence about the meaning of the war? You've described his personal experience, which sounds horrific, but also heroic. But what about the politics of the war, which were so significant in mobilizing, I would say, black critiques of American society and imperialism?
Yeah, I mean, so that question is exactly what I found so striking about analyzing Roy's speeches and who he was and who he wanted to appeal to. The thing is, he couldn't do that. Mm-hmm. It would end his livelihood. He would lose his speaking tour. You know, he would not be a hero in the same way. He wouldn't be celebrated. He certainly wouldn't run in the same circles. You know, so there's, like, just for, you know, sometimes he unwittingly sort of criticizes the Americans. And so he criticizes the American effort in Vietnam in the exact same way that Ronald Reagan does. And in fact, I think he learns from Reagan. Reagan says it was the eggheads and the liberal politicians that stopped America from winning the war. Never engages with whether or not the United States should have been there in the first place. But he says, you know, and there's all sorts of great Reagan lines that are so unwise about the war, going back to 1965 when he says we could build a parking lot in like 2 months and the war would be over. But in any event, Roy kind of follows that because that's the circle he's running with. And there are times where he does offer some criticisms, and he talks about the commanders and the politicians, but he's very, very careful to not step on the toes of people that are his allies. And so, like, there is one example where I kind of caught him criticizing Westmoreland. So him and Westmoreland have this relationship going on for a long time. And when they see each other, parade and stuff, they hug and everything. And Roy, at one point in his memoir, talks about how stupid these little cards were that the soldiers got when they arrived in Vietnam in late 1965, these little 9 rules, and how whoever produced those didn't understand anything about Vietnam. Then you go and you read Westmoreland's memoir, and Westmoreland talks about how special these little 9-rule cards were that he wanted all the soldiers to have. But Roy didn't know those cards came from Westmoreland. He wouldn't have directly criticized him. And I get into a lot of this with the book. So he's always got to kind of tiptoe, because he doesn't want to piss off the people that keep inviting him to the White House for every ceremony. You know, 1984 election year, he's at the White House like 4 or 5 times. Hispanic American stamp unveiling 2 weeks before the election. You know, like all these little gimmicks to get the Hispanic vote. And Roy's always the stand-in for Reagan. Let's bring Roy Benavidez back up here and get ourselves on the news with Roy, hugging Roy again, you know? All the time, him and Reagan. They got all these pictures of them hugging at the Reagan line. But anyway, yeah, so that question, he couldn't. That's the thing. Like, you know, that's the short answer. He couldn't, but that's what I try to explore in the book. Like, how far can he go? What can he actually say? And he's also unique in that he gets to be the hero, and like I said, the long memory in the 1980s. He didn't have to deal with talking about the Vietnam War in 1975. That would have been a very different conversation if he was a really famous hero at that time.
I haven't had a chance to read this because we've only owned it for an hour. But I spent a lot of time reading Hattiesburg. So what everybody's saying about this, you seem to have a knack for writing about people that rise from the ashes like the great Phoenix. So I'm thinking in the future, do some really great research about the way the Americans stole Hawaii from the native Hawaiians. Think about that research.
Get on it.
I mean, it seems like an attractive place to do research. And I'll just offer one more. Like, I've got so many like crazy stories from researching this book because the way I write and research, I've got to be there. So if I was writing about Hawaii, I got to go. But so yeah, from like, you know, paying people to drive me out in the Cambodian jungle to like, I once got my car stuck on a rancher's farm in August at like 2 p.m. It was like 100 degrees and he had done. I'll tell that story some other time. But yeah, like, like when you just get so wrapped up, and I know all of us historians, when you're really deep into it, like the places you get to go and the things you get to see, like I got so fascinated with Texas. That is a crazy place. I don't ever want to live there. Obviously Katie used to live there. But it's like just so fascinating, and just learning so much more about sugar beets. And you know, like everybody thinks that professors are the people that just like to talk, which you're probably agreeing with now. But really, we're just the people that want to learn the most. And it was just really fascinating, like getting to know a whole nother area of history and learning so much about a different part of the world.
Thank you for this. This is fascinating. And you obviously do in this book what people who write about individuals always want to do, which is use an individual to talk about wider dynamics and more broader themes. But I'm also reminded of this famous article about biography by Jill Lepore called what is it about biographers who love their subject too much? Am I getting the title right?
Maybe.
Help me out here. It's something about biographers loving their subjects too much. And so my question is, so it's kind of a cheeky question. You feel like you love Roy too much, or you have come out by the time the book was written? Are you vulnerable to that critique?
I could see how maybe somebody reads it and might think that. I don't love him too much. I disagree with a lot of what he does. I think he's really fascinating. I don't think I could be as interested in somebody that I totally agreed with and somebody that I was just totally in love with, to be honest with you. I don't think it would hold my interest to this level. Like, it was always, you know, what's he really thinking versus what can he really say? And you know, just some of the politics of it are just things that I personally wouldn't have agreed with him sort of swallowing or sweeping under the rug. I think that he could have done something incredibly different that might have been very, very helpful for our country with the platform, but in not questioning the war in the way that he should have. In America, not questioning the Vietnam War in the way that we should have, that directly has led us into the situation in the Middle East that we have today. And I think that would have been probably the greatest service that he could have paid to soldiers, not just veterans, but the ones that come after. And I'm afraid that in this country, we're probably going to make the same mistake because we don't like to engage honestly with our conflicts.
Yeah.
So I came to this book prepared not to like Roy. I'm only about 80 pages in, but the last scene I read was one where he's 14 and he decides to drop out of school, and he and his teacher cry together.
Yeah.
And so it's not an easy narrative if you just want to dislike him. So I guess my question for you is, who do you hope reads this book? What do you hope they learn from it?
Roy, yeah, he had a horrible life. I mean, it's hard not to have some sympathy. The people that I think are most closely attached to Roy today that I hope read this book are Hispanic American servicemen and women, who I think it's fair to have, you know, that they deserve heroes and role models. And then I think also anybody that's involved in any sort of policy or any sort of conscious citizen, there will come another time where veterans, you know, benefits and disability benefits and things like that are being questioned again. And, you know, a lot of the later parts of the book deal with not just Roy's disability case, but what Reagan was doing with social welfare. You know, I just make the point, like, these things exist for a reason. It's not just, Roy becomes, for some people locally, he becomes their welfare queen, basically. And there's a whole section locally where people are accusing him, yes, he needs to get back to work. I see him signing autographs and doing this. Take your Mexican ass back to work is what they say to him. And so, like, you know, to have a bit more sympathy about what veterans go through, to think more seriously about the commitment that you're making to veterans when you ask them to commit risking their lives to go fight for you. But then I think, you know, anybody that might think that, you know, they're pure, there's like a conservative military ideology that I'm trying to like crack up, basically. You know, that there's other things that are going on. There are other things that we should think about. And if you really care about veterans, you know, if you really actually do, and not just the pomp and circumstance of the helicopter parachutes and all that crap, you know, then you need to understand that like some of these policies need to be changed.
Does his family feel any ownership of this story?
They always do. His son is kind of the most, but he doesn't like engage with me in the same way as the daughters. Kind of just steps in to offer like little correctives and stuff. But I mean, like his story's been used by so many people, and you know, I'm just kind of the latest. There was another book about Roy and the fighting in 2015. It was largely about the battle. So they've had other people kind of come. So I don't really know. I think I'll ask them that.
Yeah.
But you know, they certainly do feel some ownership. His daughter runs the Facebook page and all that.
Yeah.
So
And Roy did write 2 books himself, or co-wrote 2 books himself about himself.
co-wrote 2 books. Yeah.
Yeah.
He was always trying to get his story even more out there.
He was indefatigable. I mean,
Yeah.
every bit of life was just run from him.
Oh, William, how did you first approach Roy's family, and what was their reaction?
I first approached Roy's family in 2015. So his papers have been donated to the archive by his son. And so through the archivist, they wrote to Noel, his son, and just said, I was a postdoc at the time, there's this postdoc who's interested in looking at your dad's papers, and he asked to meet with you, and I just emailed him, and I'm much more closer with the second daughter than the son, but that was how I initially approached him. The last book, the guy basically came in and said, I'm writing this, I would love to talk to you about it. If you're too busy, that's fine, I'm gonna write it anyway. And I was the opposite. I had to get all of their blessing, all their permission, because I knew I was gonna say a lot harder things about their dad than anyone else ever said. And I had one interview, so you know, between the time of the action and the medal is 13 years. And you know, he's always suffering, but the medal helps that suffering a lot. Because he's really famous, he gets paid, you know, like there's a stipend that comes with it. But when he's just on his own, those are some really dark years, and nobody ever talks about those. They're just invisible toward the memory of his life. But I met people that knew him during that time and really engaged with that. So, you know, I just had to have their sign off at the front end, because I knew it was going to be a little bit more difficult. But then we just they've been wonderful. You know, like the 2 daughters. The end of the book is about how he dies in the final years. Like the 2 daughters, we just sat down for like 3 hours at their kitchen table with like a box of Kleenex, and they just gave it to me. Like they gave me the whole memory of their dad's passing. It was like over years, and they were very, very generous in doing that. I met his wife. She had dementia. She died 2 years later. I could never talk to her, but all his kids are still pretty young and extremely helpful.
Well, did UT pay for his papers?
I don't know. I don't think they paid. I know Texas Tech turned it down. Texas Tech, which has a gazillion, is a huge Vietnam collection. I don't know why they turned down the most famous Texas Vietnam War veteran. But I don't think they did pay for it. No.
If I could just comment, it's really important, I think, when you're writing, how you juxtapose the Reagan administration giving money to the military and for military forces. At the same time, it's not only cutting veterans' benefits, but dealing with the entire issue of the social network. Yeah. And you do that in a really brilliant way. So I think that people are going to be able to see both that Roy could only do so much, but that you could point out that there are other things that he brought to the attention of others that then made it possible for others to do something about the larger issues.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I have some of the best stuff for getting all those angles was the Reagan administration panicking when the news breaks, and you have all that in the archives, and they're like, oh my God, this is going to kill us in this election year, or next election year, it's going to kill us with Hispanics, like what do we do? And so you really see the impact that Roy's case had, and it changes a policy that affects hundreds of thousands of people.
Well, I'm sorry, again.
Are you calling on?
I don't know. Whoever wants to.
I'll go. I just had a question. To what extent was Roy's sort of story used on the enlistment side to enlist Hispanic Americans? Oh. And also, if you could just say much about today's Army and like, you know, how Hispanic Americans, as I understand it, make an enormous disproportionate size proportion of today's Army. How it fits into that story.
So Roy gives hundreds of speeches after he becomes the Medal of Honor recipient, and part of doing that, he felt a duty to his country because Reagan asked him. Reagan asked him right then and there, along with the Secretary of Defense Weinberger, to go out and help spread the message about how wonderful the military is, to spread a patriotic message, to help recruit people to the military, to help recruit Latinos to the military. It explicitly asked him to do that. There was a role that was designed for him at one point to be like a regional director for the Southwest recruiting or something, and that never came to fruition, but Roy took it on anyway, and he talked about it all the time. I forget the second part of your question. I'm sorry.
Just how it fits in a larger story of Hispanic American enlistment in the Army.
Yeah, huge.
Is disproportionately large.
Absolutely huge. And, you know, in Texas, I've met so many people that are in the military that I'm just there, you know, doing my thing, and we just cross paths and we get to talking, and they all know who Roy is. Like so many of the Hispanic soldiers in the Army today know who Roy is. He's like their great role model. He's their great icon. And I think like even more than that, the Vietnam War, there was a draft. So you could draft rich kids. Now, of course, there's a class dimension to that. But today there's no draft, and it's working class people like Roy Benavidez. And I think to sort of center the story, Roy he has a lot of class issues within the Army itself. Like he can't become an officer because he didn't go to college. You know, he didn't even graduate high school. So he's also trying to like show up kind of those people that had more privileges, that went to the academies, you know, those sort of folks too. He's always got that chip on his shoulder. But yeah, it's like this working class Hispanic military now. I mean, that's what America's armed forces are going to be.
Well, it's a remarkable book about a remarkable man.
Can we just take Jacqueline's, and I'll be
Well, I'm going to say that, so we'll cut that and I'll say that again.
You talked earlier about how you really wanted to know what he was thinking as opposed to this public story. You had so much evidence of the public, of how he was being used, how he was using what he was saying, but how did you get at or try to get at what he was really thinking?
I mean, he emulated people a lot, and I know where his sayings came from. I read that. But, you know, like, honestly, to answer your question, it's just, at some point as a historian, you know, there's so much that we can know, but I just hit my limits and had to live with it, that I can't fully answer that question. And I think one of the things that the book does is that, you know, historians are supposed to tell these definitive, clear stories with crystal clear arguments, I think a lot of the time, and it's just a lot, it's just murkier. Like there's no one solid answer. Like I care as much about how it makes you feel as opposed to the lesson that it teaches you. And yeah, I just have to live with that I can't fully uncover. And you know, I was talking to this reporter who's a Hispanic guy in San Antonio, and he covers veterans, and like some of the stuff with the VA, like he's just like, well, you just gotta leave that alone. Like you're not gonna get there. You're never gonna find that out. You're not gonna know why he has to get moved from the VA in Houston to BAMC in San Antonio because this horrible treatment. And he's just like, that's just the end of it, man. You're not gonna get there. And you know, I just had to kind of tell myself that at some points in the book. And there's a lot of stuff incredible stuff that I found. That was great. But I just couldn't quite figure, he's still an enigma to me, to be honest with you. And I won't admit that when I'm not with friends. But there's still some things that I just never could quite figure out. But like, this dude wanted it, all of it. And it was the proof that he was as good as white people, that he got to be an American, that he got to also enjoy citizenship, that he got to live in this country, be a full-fledged member of our society. And that's what it was always all about. But what he had to do to get that was just crazy, right? And it's just like, I still, even, you know, having been to Cambodia and studied the documents and learned about the war, it still blows my mind that a kid who couldn't even sit in the front of the movie theater is asked to go protect somebody else's freedom 7,000 miles away in this illegal, illicit mission structure that's designed to get him killed. That still blows my mind that we live in the country that can ask a kid that can't even go to the movie theater, and it kills him that he can't buy the ice cream cone. It just kills him. He talks about it his whole life growing up in that way. And he's asked to go, you know, protect the freedom of South Vietnamese by killing other Vietnamese. Like, it's just, that part blows me away. So the whole, you know, like, so the book's about Roy, it's a biography, but it's also a biography of a race, of an ethnic group, and I don't think there's a good corpus of Hispanic American history, and that's part of the narrative. But then it's also this global conflict that this little boy who's segregated out of society as an orphan has got to step into if he wants to become a full-fledged member of the country that he should have been belonging to from birth.
Well, thank you, William.
Thank you all so much.